Welcome to the MuniFinanceGuy podcast. I'm Mark Moses. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the multi-billion dollar fraud that's rampant in our state and federal agencies, from ghost students in Minnesota to the massive siphoning of Medicare. And we're not just talking about a few isolated incidents. We're talking about a system where these scandals are endless and where tax dollars are being treated like free money and accountability is an optional expense. And why does this happen? And more importantly, why do we keep letting it happen again and again? That's what I want to get into on this episode. So the examples are endless, but just to cite a few of the recent ones for context here, the 2025 National Healthcare Fraud Takedown identified $14.6 billion in Medicare fraud. Some of that included cases where doctors were paid kickbacks to sign off on medically unnecessary genetic tests and medical equipment. In Minnesota, the Feeding Our Future program, which was intended to feed hungry children during the pandemic, found that there was only over $300 million was stolen from that program. The Childcare fraud, which received a lot of national attention, where they were using ghost students as a front for collecting childcare monies, resulted in about $100 million of fraud. And the investigations that followed that have led prosecutors now to estimate as much as $9 billion in taxpayer funds were stolen or put at risk across 14 state-administered programs since 2018. And then in California, $30 billion of pandemic unemployment insurance monies were lost to fraud, including to incarcerated individuals and international crime rings. So what you have here is staunch accusations of fraud, although some of what's characterized as fraud may be defensible. The doctors characterize some of the differences as billing disputes and differences of opinion as to reasonable standards of care. California claims that the federal program, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, was not well defined and encouraged a light touch with respect to qualifying individuals for eligibility. So what you have here is in some cases there's blatant fraud and misrepresentations, for example, collecting on meals that were never distributed. But in other cases, you have programs may not be well designed, where the doctors may have a defense in that maybe there is an issue about standard of care that isn't well defined in the program. And so my perspective on this is that the nature of these programs plants the seed for their abuse. And what these programs all endorse is the idea, the principle that the ends justify the means. Taking monies from some people, in this case through taxation, is okay if it's used to benefit a needy group. And I think what is important to understand about the perspective of those people operating in this kind of environment is once the money's taken through taxation, there's no additional consideration given to the effect of taking that money. For example, no one considers how that money might have been invested or spent on the values and priorities of those from whom it was taken. It's as if the government launders the money and now it's free money. And you even hear it referred to as free money. And that just propagates this and sustains this kind of culture where once it's free, then anything that's done with it that benefits anybody can be considered positive. You've got a bureaucracies across the country that are administering these programs, some at the federal level, some at the state level. And in these programs, there's a push to get the money out the door. I remember working in city government where we'd get calls from state agencies saying, hey, don't you have a need for this money, whether it was a outright grant money or a loan program, because it was their job to administer these funds, and it was embarrassing if there was nobody participating. The mentality then is speed and signing people up is prioritized over the integrity of the program, to the extent that you can say that there's any integrity to these programs. And granting agencies are judged by how many people they sign up, not by any kind of standard of quality. When you think about who is attracted to these programs, the culture of cities with respect to grants is, let's go after this money. It's money we wouldn't otherwise get. And so the priorities of cities get pulled in the direction of what grants happen to be available. Once you've got people engaged in this, whether it's a local government going after grants, whether it's a state administering a federal program, or a nonprofit, it feels like you're doing the agency a favor by participating in the program and spending the money. And if that's the case, then pushing the limits of the program's rules seems like a justifiable commitment to the beneficiaries of the program. And then fraud can seem almost like a victimless crime. So it's not surprising that these programs are swimming in accusations of negligence, quasi-fraud, and outright fraud. In this easy money environment, money's not obtained by convincing someone to voluntarily sponsor or invest in an activity, but it's just complying with paperwork and often poorly written guidelines. I watched a county pass a tax for the special recreation program. They had no idea how they were going to administer it. They hired a management analyst to pretty much write the rules of the program. So these are not well thought out programs in general. There's no real correcting mechanism when things go awry. In contrast, in the realm of private charities, if you're irresponsible with how you administer one of your programs or activities, you're going to lose donors. And when you lose money, you don't get to go back and for that same money again. In the realm of government programs, there's no such check and balance. It's basically a potentially endless supply of this free money. And so the dilemma that's created here by these programs is that because they create this appearance of free money, they're attracting the worst elements. They're being administered by bureaucracies whose incentives are not aligned with accountability, because the intense auditing that would need to take place to counter all these factors is much more rigorous than what would be necessary in a private environment. But that's also expensive. So the auditing is limited in the name of administrative efficiency. And then when the fraud hits, there's a political incentive to minimize the transgression. And you'll see theft and some of the more egregious fraud is rebranded as improper payments. We've reached a strange point in our culture where we would rather tolerate a government program that loses billions to negligence, billions to fraud, rather than rely on private charity, private endeavors that actually deliver results. And there are countless examples of private charities and private action, whether it's some of the groups that respond to emergency type situations, natural disasters. Private organizations often beat the federal agencies to those locations and are much quicker to anticipate and respond because they don't have the bureaucracy that these agencies have. They don't have to ask for levels of permission to respond. The Team Rubicon, for example, is often faster at getting to a natural disaster than FEMA. I would argue that Alcoholics Anonymous is more effective than the drug programs like the DARE program that's administered in the public schools. And so At this point, we're not just subsidizing the needy anymore. We're subsidizing the friction of our own lack of trust in private action. We have to stop pretending that these improper payments are victimless. Every dollar lost to a fraudulent grant is a dollar taken from a family who could have invested it, a business that could have grown, or a private initiative that could have actually solved the problem. And so the truth is, government agencies do not have a correcting mechanism, but you out there do. And it starts with realizing that the most expensive thing that we can ever buy is the illusion of free money. And that if we endorse a principle of ends justifying the means, we are going to be trapped in this unfortunate loop. Thanks for listening.